My parents uninvited me from their 40th anniversary party and called it elite only. They told people I was mentally unwell and said they couldn't risk me embarrassing them. My mother actually said, "We can't have you embarrassing us," like I was some unstable liability, and my father followed it with, "It's for the best." I didn't argue. I just stood there, checked the time on my phone like I was confirming a train schedule, and locked the screen. Across the room, my sister, Rachel, suddenly rushed to my mother and leaned in close, her voice low but urgent. "Mom, you need to see this. Now." My name is Eliza Bennett. I'm 35. If I'm being honest, none of what they said that night came out of nowhere. For years, my work had been reduced. That's the cleanest word for it. Reduced to a hobby, a quirk, something vaguely adorable that didn't require real intelligence or ambition. I'm a historic preservation architect. I restore structures that most people have already given up on: estates, civic buildings, houses with bones so old they creak when you look at them. It's technical. It's structural engineering layered with historical research and compliance codes and grant negotiations. It's not tinkering. But that's how they introduce me. At charity events, my mother would gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "This is Eliza. She tinkers with old buildings." She'd laugh lightly afterward, like she'd just delivered something self-deprecating on my behalf. People would smile at me the way you smile at someone who runs an Etsy candle shop. My father's version was sharper. "She's practically a handyman," he once said, clapping my shoulder as if I carried a toolbox in my trunk at all times. I remember the pressure of his hand more than the words, firm, performative, proud in a way that felt misaligned. Like he was proud I'd found something harmless to occupy myself with. I would correct them at first, softly. "I'm an architect." I'd explain restoration strategy or landmark compliance in a sentence or two. Their eyes would glaze over almost immediately. My sister, Rachel, would jump in with something breezy about her own projects or the nonprofit circles she moved in. The conversation would shift effortlessly, and I'd be left standing there, holding a profession that apparently didn't translate into their world. It wasn't explosive, it was incremental. There were family photos where I'd later notice the cropping. At first, I told myself it was accidental framing, but then it kept happening. Christmas cards where I was angled out at the edge, anniversary albums where I was missing entirely from group shots I knew I'd stood in. Once I asked about it casually, and my mother waved it off. "Oh, sweetheart, you were blinking." Or, "We just liked this one better." It's a strange thing, realizing you've been edited out of your own history. And I adjusted. That's the part I don't love admitting. I stopped correcting them as much. I'd smile when they diminished it. I'd let the handyman joke land. I convinced myself that if I worked hard enough, if the buildings spoke loudly enough, it wouldn't matter what they called me at cocktail parties. But it did something quiet inside me. Every introduction like that shaved off a thin layer of confidence. Not enough to collapse, just enough to sting. And the sting built. By the time they called the anniversary party elite only, it wasn't shocking. It was consistent. It was the natural extension of a decade of being gently positioned as less impressive, less polished, less worthy of certain rooms. They hadn't suddenly decided I didn't belong. They'd been rehearsing that idea for years. The text came 3 days before the party. It wasn't even a phone call. I remember the exact way it looked on my screen, a short bubble from my mother, too polished to be impulsive. She said they'd decided to keep the anniversary intimate. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added that it was really more of an elite circle, and they didn't want to have to explain my situation to certain guests. My situation. I read that line 3 times. There was no situation. I wasn't in trouble. I wasn't in crisis. I wasn't spiraling. I was working 12-hour days on a restoration deadline and eating too much takeout like every other adult I knew. But the way she phrased it made me sound fragile. Volatile, like I might knock over a champagne tower if unsupervised. My father followed up an hour later. Separate message, shorter. He said it would be simpler this way, that they didn't want any awkwardness, that it was for the best. For whose best, I almost typed back. I didn't send it. The shock wasn't explosive. It was cold. It was that familiar tightening behind my ribs, the one that happens when something humiliating lands exactly where you've always suspected it might. Part of me had known I didn't fit their image of a polished anniversary celebration, but being formally excluded, that made it official. The next layer came the following afternoon. Aunt Lorraine called. Her voice was careful in that overly gentle way people use when they believe they're handling something delicate. She said she understood if I needed space. She said she hoped I was taking care of myself. There was a pause where I could feel her waiting for confirmation of something I hadn't said. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then admitted my mother had told a few people I'd been struggling lately. That it would be better if I didn't attend because large gatherings might be overwhelming for me right now. Overwhelming? I actually laughed when she said it, not because it was funny, because my body didn't know what else to do. That was when it shifted from hurt to something heavier. This wasn't just about not wanting me in a room. It was about constructing a narrative to justify my absence, a narrative that positioned me as unstable enough to need managing. It explained away my non-attendance before anyone could question it. It protected them, and it quietly damaged me. I started replaying recent conversations in my head, wondering who else had heard it, who was nodding sympathetically behind my back, who now viewed my career, my independence, my choices through the lens of some invisible breakdown. My name was being handled without me present. And what unsettled me most wasn't that my mother could say it. It was how easily it would be believed. Because once someone floats the idea that you're unwell, every boundary you set becomes proof. Every absence becomes confirmation. The party stopped being just a party. It became a public erasure, curated, pre-explained, socially padded, so no one would question why their daughter wasn't there. I wasn't just uninvited. I was pre-discredited. Rachel called the evening after Aunt Lorraine did. Her voice was soft in that careful, almost syrupy way she uses when she wants to appear compassionate. She didn't mention the party at first. She asked how I was sleeping, if I was handling everything okay. There was a weight under her words, like she was nudging me toward admitting something. I told her I was fine. There was a pause, not long, just long enough to signal that my answer didn't fit the script. She sighed lightly and said she just worried about me, that the anniversary party would be a lot. That most of the guests were people from their social and professional circles, and it might feel uncomfortable. She didn't say I wouldn't belong. She didn't have to. It was implied in the way she framed it, their world, their level, their expectations. She said she didn't want me to feel out of place. Out of place in my own family. I felt something tighten in my throat, but I kept my voice even. I asked her what exactly she thought would be overwhelming about standing in a room and saying congratulations to our parents. She pivoted smoothly, said I've always been more comfortable behind the scenes. That big social gatherings weren't really my thing, that maybe this just wasn't the right environment for me. It was subtle. If you didn't know her, you'd miss it. She was painting me as fragile without ever using the word. Then she added, almost casually, that mom had been stressed trying to manage how to explain everything to certain guests, that it would just be easier if I skipped it, that people in that circle don't always understand unconventional paths. Unconventional. I build structures that last a century, but somehow in her telling, I was the unstable one. After we hung up, my father called. There was no softness in his tone. He said he didn't want any drama at the party, that he'd worked hard to cultivate relationships in that room, that I needed to understand how appearances mattered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me directly of anything. He simply framed my absence as responsible. He said I'd made choices that took me in a different direction from the family's image. That sometimes consequences follow choices. That was the word that landed. Consequences. I hadn't committed a crime. I hadn't embarrassed anyone publicly. I had simply built a career they didn't fully grasp, and that, apparently, required containment. When the call ended, I sat there staring at my phone, and for the first time, the pattern aligned cleanly. The text, Aunt Lorraine's careful sympathy, Rachel's concern, my father's language about appearances, it wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a misunderstanding that spiraled. It was coordinated. They had decided on a narrative, they had rehearsed it, they had distributed it. And the most unsettling part wasn't the cruelty. It was the calm. And here's the part that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. The party was being held at Whitfield House. I restored Whitfield House. Not as a contractor, not as someone who tinkered. I led the preservation plan. I fought for the grant approvals. I stood in hard hats with structural engineers while we mapped foundation fractures and stabilized beams that had been sagging for decades. I researched original blueprints that had been half-eaten by time and humidity. I worked through months of negotiations to keep the facade historically accurate while bringing the plumbing and wiring into this century. Whitfield House wasn't just another job. It was the kind of restoration architects hope for once in their career, a property with lineage, craftsmanship, and just enough decay to require real vision. When I first walked through it, dust was layered thick over the banisters, sections of molding were split, windows fogged and rotting at the frames. It felt abandoned but proud, like it was waiting for someone to notice it still had structure worth saving. I noticed, and 2 years later it stood whole again, not modernized into something unrecognizable, restored, balanced between past and present. Every cornice, every original staircase curve, every inch of reclaimed wood, intentional. My parents booked it for their anniversary because it was elegant, because it impressed people, because its name carried weight. They invited donors, business associates, and one person in particular, Diane Harper, the executive director of the National Preservation Trust. They wanted her there because her presence elevated the room, because she symbolized prestige. They never mentioned to her, or to most of the guests, that the estate they were celebrating inside had been brought back to life by their daughter. Not once did my mother say, "Eliza led this restoration." Instead, I was overwhelmed, struggling, not up to social events. I kept picturing the wide staircase I'd spent weeks ensuring could bear modern load requirements without losing its original curvature. Guests would be gliding their hands along the railing I had insisted be restored instead of replaced. They would admire the ballroom ceiling that we'd carefully stabilized, piece by piece, preserving hand-painted detailing that had nearly collapsed. And I wasn't supposed to be in the room. The irony wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. They were hosting an elite celebration inside my work, while implying I wasn't stable enough to attend. I tried to tell myself it was just oversight, that maybe they didn't think it mattered who restored it, but that didn't align with how carefully they curated everything else. The guest list, the catering, the optics. They understood prestige perfectly. They just didn't connect it to me. And that was the tension that sat heavy in my throat the week of the party, knowing that my fingerprints were on every archway, every restored column, and yet my presence was the one thing they decided didn't belong. The night of the party, I didn't go. But I knew exactly what that house would look like at dusk. The exterior lanterns casting warm light across the restored stone. The front lawn trimmed with surgical precision. Valise lining the curved drive I had once watched construction trucks rumble through when the place was still unstable. Guests began arriving just after 6. I know this because my phone started lighting up, social media posts, tagged photos, short videos of champagne glasses clinking beneath the ceiling medallion I'd fought to preserve. People were already admiring the craftsmanship, commenting on the timeless elegance, zooming in on architectural details. Details I could identify from a thumbnail image. There was a photo of the grand staircase, the one with the reinforced substructure no one would ever see, and someone had written, "This place is breathtaking." My mother had replied publicly, "We're so lucky to celebrate here." Lucky. Then Diane Harper arrived. I didn't see her walk in, obviously, but I heard about it almost immediately. Aunt Lorraine texted me first, just a short message saying Diane was asking about me, that she'd expected to meet me tonight, that she seemed surprised I wasn't there. That part made my stomach drop. Diane Harper isn't someone who casually wonders about people. She's deliberate, observant. If she noticed my absence, it wasn't polite curiosity. It meant my name had already been part of some prior conversation. A few minutes later, another message came. This time from a mutual professional contact who happened to be there. They said Diane was admiring the restoration work, asking who led it. asking specific questions about structural preservation choices. And my mother answered. Not with my name. With a soft explanation about how I'd been going through something lately, how large events were a bit much right now, how they were focusing on keeping things calm and stable. Calm and stable. The phrasing was careful, controlled, almost compassionate. But it reframed my absence as fragility. I could picture it, my mother tilting her head slightly, lowering her voice just enough to suggest sensitivity. My father nodding beside her, reinforcing the idea without elaborating too much. They wouldn't overplay it. They'd let implication do the work. What they didn't expect was Diane asking follow-up questions. Not confrontational, just precise. When did this start? Was I still working? Was I stepping back from projects? Because here's the thing, if someone is truly unwell, their professional presence shifts. It leaves traces. And there were no traces. From what I was later told, the energy changed slightly in that circle. Nothing explosive, just a faint tightening. A few guests exchanging glances. Aunt Lorraine, who had believed the narrative earlier, apparently hesitated before nodding along this time. Small cracks. Not loud enough to break the evening. But noticeable. The house stood perfect and luminous around them, every beam steady, every arch intact. And the story about me started to feel less stable than the foundation beneath their feet. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the announcement went live. I know the time because I had been staring at it all evening, aware of the embargo lifting. I hadn't told my parents about the nomination when I first found out. Part of me didn't want to hand them something else to minimize before it was official. Part of me just wanted one thing untouched. The American Institute of Architects released the list. My name was on it, nominated for the gold medal for the restoration of Whitfield House. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the notifications started. My phone vibrated once, then again, then in rapid succession, emails, texts from colleagues, industry contacts, former professors. The Architectural Digest feature dropped almost simultaneously, highlighting the restoration as a model of preservation integrity. There was a professional photo of me standing in the Whitfield House ballroom, the restored ceiling stretching above me, and beneath it, a quote pulled from my interview. I'd said, I learned early that sometimes your work has to speak louder than the rooms you're not invited into. At the time, it felt like a quiet line, reflective, controlled. In that moment, it became something else. Across town, inside the party I wasn't allowed to attend, phones began lighting up too. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it in fragments later. One guest checking a notification, another turning their screen toward someone nearby, a ripple effect. Someone recognizing the name immediately because Diane Harper had just been asking about me. The room didn't erupt, it shifted. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Glasses hovered just before touching lips. The name that had been discussed in hushed, concerned tones minutes earlier was now attached to the highest honor in American architecture. And it wasn't abstract. The feature explicitly credited the restoration of Whitfield House. Guests didn't need to connect dots, the dots were labeled. From what I was told, someone pulled up the Architectural Digest article on a tablet. The image, my image, clear against the backdrop of the ballroom they were standing in. The caption naming me lead architect. The article detailing the structural challenges, the preservation strategies, the scope of the project. The narrative about me being overwhelmed didn't disappear immediately. It dissolved. Because the timeline didn't make sense anymore. You don't lead a nationally recognized restoration while quietly unraveling behind the scenes. You don't earn a gold medal nomination by stepping back from your career. Energy in the room changed temperature. That's the only way I can describe it. The earlier sympathy curdled into confusion. Confusion sharpened into something closer to scrutiny. My name wasn't being spoken gently anymore. It was being spoken with recognition. And suddenly, the absence my parents had carefully pre-explained wasn't delicate. It was glaring. The first person to say something directly was Aunt Lorraine. I didn't hear it live, but 3 different people recounted it almost the same way. She had her phone in her hand, the Architectural Digest article open, my photo bright against the restored ballroom walls. She looked from the screen to my mother and asked, not loudly, but clearly enough, why none of this had been mentioned. Why hadn't they told anyone their daughter led the restoration? Why, if I was struggling so badly, was my work being nationally recognized tonight? It wasn't an accusation at first, it was confusion, but confusion in a room like that spreads quickly. My mother tried to recover. She said she hadn't wanted to make the evening about Eliza, that the focus was supposed to be the marriage, not professional achievements. Her smile, I was told, was tight, controlled, the kind she uses when she's recalculating. But then someone else asked why they'd implied I wasn't well enough to attend. And that's when the tone shifted. Diane Harper stepped in, not aggressively, but decisively. She had already read the nomination announcement. She knew the timeline. She knew the scale of the work. And she knew, very clearly, that I had been fully engaged throughout the entire restoration process. She publicly praised the project, not vaguely, specifically. She spoke about the structural stabilization, the historical integrity preserved, the craftsmanship. She said the nomination was well-deserved. Well-deserved. Those words landed in a room that had been primed to see me as unstable. From what I was told, you could almost see the math happening behind people's eyes, the elegant estate around them, the national recognition, the calm professionalism of the woman leading the preservation world's most respected organization, validating my work in real time. And then, right beside her, my parents' earlier explanation about my fragility. The two stories didn't align. My father attempted to pivot. He said they were proud, of course they were proud. That maybe there had been a misunderstanding, that they had simply wanted to protect my privacy. Protect it from what? No one said it out loud, but the question hung there. My mother reportedly doubled down once more, softening her tone, suggesting that success and personal struggles aren't mutually exclusive. It was a clever deflection. It almost worked. Except Diane didn't engage with that narrative at all. She kept it professional. She spoke about my discipline, my reliability, my leadership under pressure. Every trait she highlighted directly contradicted the image my parents had circulated. The room didn't explode into drama. It went quiet. And quiet can be far more brutal. Because once people sense they've been misled, they don't argue, they withdraw, they observe, they remember. My parents' anniversary celebration was no longer floating on polished prestige. It was sitting inside a contradiction they couldn't smooth over. And for the first time that night, they weren't controlling the story anymore. The ripple of disbelief didn't stop with my parents. Rachel's carefully constructed narrative started to unravel almost immediately. Friends who had once nodded along, repeating the fragile daughter story in private, suddenly had their own evidence in front of them. Phones lit up with the AIA announcement, Architectural Digest feature, screenshots from social media posts, all showing me active, engaged, and professional. The contrast was stark. Subtle murmurs began circulating, and a few people quietly exchanged glances that said, without words, something isn't right here. Rachel's face, I was told, was tight at first, that practiced half-smile she wears when she's trying to smooth over a conversation. But as more guests pulled up the article and compared it with what she'd been saying, the cracks became visible. A friend whispered a question. You said Eliza had stepped back. Did you mean from this project? The pause that followed was telling. The smile faltered. Her answers became clipped, vague, defensive. Each follow-up question exposed another layer of inconsistency. The stories she had told, about my alleged struggles, my supposed retreat from their world. Even the charity projects she'd claimed I had undermined started collapsing under the light of verified information. Her husband, Mark, was one of the first to confront it directly. He had been listening, observing, cross-checking what he knew. The recognition of deliberate misrepresentation hit him hard. According to witnesses, he pulled her aside privately at first, voice low but edged with frustration. These aren't just exaggerations, he said. You've been lying about her life. The confrontation escalated quietly but visibly. Tension in posture, the way he avoided eye contact with the other guests but kept it fixed on her, the rigid set of her shoulders, her attempts at plausible denial faltering. Word spread, and Rachel's social credibility within that circle began to erode in real time. Invitations she had once taken for granted were reconsidered. Friends who had sought her validation before were now hesitant, unsure whether she was trustworthy. The more she tried to repair the image, the more obvious it became that it had been built on fabrications. She faltered under questions she hadn't prepared for, misremembered details, and her once unquestioned authority over certain family narratives slipped away. Even within her marriage, the consequences were immediate. Mark's trust wavered visibly. She could no longer rely on the default alignment he had offered her in social situations. Friends noticed the tension, the quiet distance, the way he avoided defending her as he had before. It wasn't a dramatic public argument, nothing like a scene in the living room, but the shift in perception was palpable. Rachel was struggling to maintain her image, and every attempt to justify her previous assertions only deepened the fracture between reality and the persona she had presented for years. And all of this happened while I wasn't even there. My absence, which they had hoped would reinforce their story, instead became the catalyst for its undoing. Guests were connecting dots, questioning motives, and seeing inconsistencies everywhere. A slow, public collapse that left Rachel scrambling to preserve anything she could. By the end of the evening, her confident facade had cracked enough for everyone present to see the truth behind it, quietly but unmistakably. I showed up the next day, not to argue in front of anyone else, not to repair optics, not to negotiate. I needed them to hear me, raw, unfiltered. When I walked into the living room, my parents were lingering over coffee, pretending the night before hadn't been upended by their own decisions. My mother's eyes flicked to me first, the tightness in her smile unmistakable. My father shifted slightly in his chair, a mix of caution and defensiveness that I had seen so many times before. But I didn't wait for them to speak. "I'm done," I said, voice low but steady. I could feel the years of restraint coiling inside me, the tension of being minimized, dismissed, ignored. A decade of being told I don't belong, that I'm a disappointment, that I'm unwell, that my work doesn't matter, it ends here. My father opened his mouth, probably to deflect, to offer the usual empty reassurance or excuse. My mother's fingers twitched against her mug, the gesture of someone bracing, calculating. I let them pause, let the silence stretch, because they had spent years doing exactly that to me. I don't need to explain myself anymore. I'm not apologizing for who I am, what I've accomplished, or where I choose to be, I continued. My words weren't loud, but they were deliberate, each one punctuated with the weight of every subtle insult, every exclusion from photos, every whispered rumor about my stability. You've told everyone else for years what they should think about me. I don't have to let you tell me anymore. I saw the slight flicker of recognition cross their faces. Not remorse, not understanding, just a brief acknowledgement that control was slipping, that the narrative they'd spent decades shaping had been dismantled while I wasn't even in the room. I let my hands fall to my sides and took a step back, then another, until I reached the door. My breath was steady, my chest tight but contained. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. They had already understood what I meant, whether they liked it or not. Outside, I felt the weight lift almost immediately. For the first time in years, the space that had been filled with subtle judgment and restraint felt mine. My freedom wasn't a dramatic flourish. It was a simple, controlled act. I walked away. I had said what needed saying, set the boundary, and left it intact. And in that silence, after a decade of explaining myself to people who didn't listen, I realized it was over. I didn't have to earn their approval. I didn't have to justify my choices. I didn't have to exist under their terms anymore. The door clicked behind me, and with it, the last tether holding me to their narrative finally released. In the weeks after the party, the ripple effects were undeniable. Rachel's carefully constructed social persona continued to fracture. I heard from mutual friends that Mark had confronted her repeatedly about the fabrications she'd spread, the exaggerations, the small lies, the charity claims that didn't hold up. Their conversations weren't just tense, they were shaking the foundation of her marriage. Invitations she'd relied on, the effortless social trust she'd taken for granted, were quietly rescinded. Even within her own circle, people began questioning the stories she told, the projects she claimed credit for, and the control she'd assumed over narratives that weren't hers to tell. She was scrambling, visibly and uncomfortably, trying to patch a reputation that couldn't be fully repaired. My father reached out cautiously after a week or so, the messages polite but hesitant. "I'd like to hear about your next project," he wrote, a tentative olive branch that still carried distance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not an admission of wrongdoing, but it was recognition, a subtle acknowledgement that I had won a measure of professional and personal authority he could no longer ignore. My mother, on the other hand, remained in her familiar pattern. Denial was her refuge. She didn't reach out, she didn't comment. She acted as though none of it had happened, holding tight to her story even in the face of incontrovertible evidence. For me, the effect was immediate, internal, and irreversible. Walking away from the confrontation, from the small dramas of their approval, I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. The freedom wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fireworks moment. It was the quiet, unshakable certainty that my life, my work, and my choices didn't need validation from anyone who had spent decades diminishing me. I had stepped out of their narrative, and they had no hold on the frame anymore. Every decision I made, every accomplishment I earned, existed in the world fully on its own terms. It was dominance without spectacle. The room of their influence had emptied, leaving me standing solidly in my own. The power shift was complete. I didn't need their praise or permission to define my worth. They had tried to contain me, to define me by absence and rumor, and yet the story I'd lived, the work I'd done, had rewritten the narrative faster than they could intervene. And I felt it, the real, lasting weight of autonomy, the kind that doesn't fade or shrink under anyone else's scrutiny. I didn't turn back. I didn't second guess. I moved forward knowing that my life, my achievements, and my reputation were mine, untouchable by the manipulations of family who had once seemed inescapable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out the next story in the description. There's more where this came from. The freedom, once earned, was permanent.